My brother tore up my business agreements. Dad brushed it off. It's just paper. Help your brother out. I said nothing and left. By 6 a.m., his $200,000 Bentley was scrapped. Years later, my agency is worth $2. 7 a.m., and my brother is desperate for a loan. There are three things my father trusts more than actual facts, and those are golf handicaps, dusty business books written sometime in the late 80s, and my brother Mark. Mark runs my father's consulting company, at least on paper. In reality, I'm the one handling the deals that keep the place breathing. But officially, Dad calls Mark the future of the firm, while I get labeled as the guy who's good with details. What that really means is Mark gets praised and I get buried in work. Growing up, I was never the main plan, just the fallback, the spare tire, the kid fixing broken stuff while framed photos of Mark line the hallway. By the time Mark turned 34, he had a shiny CEO title, a $140,000 paycheck, and a corner office overlooking the mountains, while I was 29, crammed into a converted storage closet with a wobbly desk and a chair that squealed like it was dying every time I moved. I had no salary, no equity, and nothing to show for 6 years except a deep understanding of how the business actually ran. Did it get to me? Yeah, sometimes, probably more than I wanted to admit, but by year 3, I'd learned that complaining didn't change anything. Mark handled the handshakes and smiles. I handled the clients. He closed maybe one deal every few months, and I closed everything else. Out of the last 14 contracts, 11 came directly through me, including Microsoft Regional, an Adobe partnership, and a Salesforce integration, yet Dad announced every one of them as Mark's victories, while I got a nod or maybe a quiet, nice work on the proposal if I was lucky. Somewhere along the way, I convinced myself I was fine being invisible, or at least I thought I was, until one Tuesday night in September when Mark destroyed $340,000 worth of signed contracts, and I realized invisible and disposable weren't the same thing. That night, after landing 3 major deals totaling $340,000, I didn't expect praise or applause, so I printed the contracts on high-quality paper, slid them into a leather portfolio, and planned to file them first thing in the morning. It was 9:47 p.m. The office was empty, the lights were running on timers, and I was halfway into my jacket when I heard the front door open, followed by uneven footsteps and someone humming a tune that didn't actually exist. Mark staggered into the main area, his tie loose, his shirt half untucked, smelling like whiskey and steak from a client dinner Dad had dropped $600 on, the same dinner I wasn't invited to. When he saw me, he blinked like I was a piece of furniture he'd forgotten about and waved me off without saying a word, so I turned toward the door until I heard the sound of paper rustling behind me. When I looked back, Mark was standing at my desk holding the contracts, not even reading them, just gripping them like they personally annoyed him. I took a step forward as he walked to the industrial shredder and flipped it on, and when I said his name, he fed the first contract in, watching the Microsoft logo, signatures, and terms vanish into nothing. I said his name louder as the second contract went in, a medical device company this time, shredded just as clean, and when I moved toward him, he fed the third one in too, a real estate firm, all while humming like he was alone. When the shredder finally went quiet, Mark brushed his hands together, patted my shoulder as he passed me, and walked out without a single word, his Bentley roaring to life outside before disappearing down the street. I stood there with my keys in my hand and my jacket half on, eventually walking over to the shredder and staring at 30 pounds of paper confetti that used to represent 6 months of my life. I didn't yell, didn't punch anything, and didn't call him. I just stood there breathing for a moment before returning to my desk, opening the drawer, and pulling out the USB drive with every client file I'd ever created, my notebook full of contacts, my AirPods, and a photo of me and Dad from 2019 at the Adobe partnership announcement, his arm around my shoulder, which I stared at for 10 seconds before setting it face down and taking everything else. On my way out, I glanced into Mark's office with its leather chair, mahogany desk, golf clubs, and shiny nameplate that read Mark Caldwell, CEO, then kept walking, armed the alarm at the front door, and felt my phone buzz with a message from Mark asking if I locked up. I replied that the alarm was set, then got another message reminding me about his 9 a.m. pitch the next morning and asking for help with the slides, which I stared at for 5 seconds before opening my contacts, typing Dad a short message that said I'm done, don't call, sending it, blocking his number, blocking Mark's number, and driving home in my 10-year-old Honda with a trunk held shut by a bungee cord. I sat in the car outside my studio apartment that cost me $340 a month, opened my banking app, and looked at $11,680, money I'd saved over 2 years from side gigs Dad never knew about, freelancing on weekends for small businesses, my just-in-case fund, which turned out to be for that exact night. Inside the apartment, I dropped my bag, opened my laptop, pulled up Google Maps, and looked at Mark's condo in Scottsdale, a luxury building where his Bentley would be parked in garage spot 214, then opened my wallet and took out a key Mark had given me 3 years earlier as an emergency backup that I'd never used until now. I made 3 calls, starting with Jake from college who ran a tow company, offering him $500 cash under the table, and when he asked whose car it was, I told him it didn't matter and texted him the address. Next, I called Luis at a scrapyard and asked how much he'd give for a Bentley, which made him laugh before saying $8,000 for parts, and I told him we had a deal. Then I called the security desk at Mark's condo, lowered my voice, said I was Mark Caldwell, and told her a tow truck was coming around 2 a.m. for scheduled maintenance, which she accepted without question. I sat there holding the key, briefly thought about calling Mark to ask why, then remembered his face and that humming sound while my work got shredded, so I pocketed the key and drove to Scottsdale, parking across the street at 1:58 a.m. Texting Jake the details for spot 214 and the silver Bentley, and replying yeah when he asked if I was really doing this. 15 minutes later, a white tow truck with covered logos rolled in, waved through security, and came back out with the Bentley strapped to the flatbed, a car that cost $217,000 and that Dad had co-signed for because Mark could barely keep up with the payments. I followed them west into an industrial area filled with chain-link fences and auto shops until we reached Luis's salvage yard, its gate open and sign half-lit, where Luis, a grease-stained man in his 50s, walked around the Bentley like it was alien technology, ran his hand along the hood, popped it open, peered inside, and whistled low before asking if it was a repo. I told him it was something like that, asked if the title being clean mattered, and when he shrugged, he circled it once more, checked the leather seats and would trim that Mark paid extra to maintain, then straightened up, pulled an envelope from his back pocket, and handed me $8,200 in cash, which felt heavier than it should as I peeled off $500 for Jake and watched him pocket it without a word. Jake slipped the cash into his pocket, gave me a quick nod, and drove off without saying another word. And then Luis motioned toward the back of the yard and asked if I wanted to watch, to which I said yeah, and followed him past rows of crushed cars stacked like giant metallic pancakes, some familiar shapes still obvious like a Honda Civic, a Ford F-150, and a Prius that looked like it had picked a fight with a semi and lost badly. The crusher sat dead center, a massive industrial hydraulic press that looked powerful enough to flatten a school bus without breaking a sweat, and Luis climbed into the operator cage, fired it up, and the engine roared as the hydraulics hissed to life, while Jake's flatbed positioned the Bentley perfectly underneath. Luis leaned out, looked down at me, and asked if I was ready. I nodded once, and he hit the button as the press began to descend slowly, mechanically, and with an inevitability that made it hard to look away. The first contact came at the roof, metal buckling with a soft crunch that quickly turned louder as the windshield spiderwebbed, and then exploded, glass raining down like ice while the frame compressed, doors folding inward, windows shattering one by one from driver to passenger to rear. The leather seats collapsed flat, the dashboard folded in on itself, and the steering wheel vanished into the console as the noise grew deafening, grinding and screaming metal, sounding like the car itself was protesting its own death. It was Mark's car, my father's co-signed loan, the rolling symbol of everything they handed him while I had to earn scraps, and I watched the whole thing without smiling or cheering, just standing there with my arms crossed and my face blank. 6 minutes, maybe 7, and then the press stopped, reversed, and lifted away, leaving behind something that wasn't a car anymore but a cube, about 3 feet by 3 feet, 900 pounds of German engineering crushed into scrap. Luis climbed down, looked at the cube, then at me, and said it was quite a way to spend $8,000, and I told him it was worth every dollar, which made him laugh as he chose not to ask any more questions. I pulled out my phone, took a photo of the cube, unrecognizable and perfect, temporarily unblocked Mark, sent him the picture with the message, "Found your old draft," recycled it, then blocked him again and drove home. By 6:14 a.m., the sun was coming up, washing the Phoenix skyline in pink and gold, and once inside my apartment I sat on the couch as my phone started buzzing nonstop. So I turned it off, opened my laptop, updated my LinkedIn to say I was open for consulting opportunities in brand strategy, market positioning, and client acquisition, posted it, closed the laptop, and fell asleep. I woke up at 11:30 a.m. to pounding on my door and checked the peephole to see Mark standing there red-faced, sweaty, still wearing yesterday's clothes, and I didn't open it as he pounded harder, yelling about his car and threatening jail while I sat on the couch watching the door shake. Eventually he stopped, and I heard him pacing in the hallway on the phone with Dad, rambling about the car being gone, a photo, it being crushed, and how he couldn't prove anything. Then the footsteps moved off toward the elevator and disappeared. I turned my phone back on to see 47 missed calls and 89 texts, messages from Mom asking what happened, Mark spiraling, Dad demanding I call immediately, my Aunt Carol confused, and when I opened the family group chat I saw Mom had added me back and Mark was telling everyone I destroyed his car over accidentally throwing away paperwork, while Dad said they raised me better than that. I read everything and then typed one reply, explaining that Mark shredded $340,000 in signed contracts the night before, called them old drafts, and that Dad told me it was just paper and to help Mark's pitch anyway, adding that I disagreed and that his $200,000 car was now also just paper and that I was better at efficiency than they thought. Before telling them not to contact me and hitting send, I watched the typing indicators pop up and then left the chat before anyone could reply, blocked everyone, checked my banking app, and saw just under 19,000 left, which gave me maybe 3 or 4 months if I lived on ramen. When I opened my LinkedIn messages, I already had 2 inquiries, one from Tom Chun, the Microsoft regional director, asking where I went because Mark said the contract was lost even though he knew I wrote it, and asking me to call him. I replied immediately that I left the firm the night before, had copies of everything, and was operating independently if he wanted to keep working together, offering to send a new agreement that day, and 3 minutes later he replied that he was in and that he wasn't working with Mark anymore. He was working with me. I leaned back and smiled for the first time in 6 years, not because Mark lost his car, but because I finally understood that some people inherit value while others build it, and Mark inherited a title, an office, and a car he couldn't afford, while I built relationships that followed me out the door. Sitting in my tiny apartment with just over $19,000 and no safety net, I wasn't scared, I was free. 2 weeks went by with no responses to job applications, and LinkedIn showing Mark's connections viewing my profile, while the Phoenix marketing scene quietly buzzed, and every morning I checked my bank balance like it was a horror movie I couldn't stop watching as the numbers dropped and rent loomed. On Thursday afternoon, I found a yellow 3-day notice taped to my door, tore it down, crumpled it, paid rent that night, ate ramen again for the 5th night in a row with hot sauce, just to pretend it was a choice, and sat in silence with no calls from Dad, no messages from Mark, and no check-ins from Mom. At 11 p.m., I opened my laptop and saw one new email from Tom Chin titled, "Where'd you go?" explaining he tried my old office number, heard I was no longer with the company, and that Mark claimed the contract was lost in a filing error even though Tom had a copy and knew I wrote it, asking me to call him. I stared at the message for a full minute, realizing Mark was telling clients the contracts were lost, not shredded, then replied that I left 2 weeks ago, had copies of everything including his contract, and could continue working independently if he wanted, hovering over send before finally clicking it and going to bed. At 6:47 a.m., my phone buzzed with Tom's reply saying let's do it, send the paperwork. He wasn't working with Mark, he was working with me, and asking if I knew anyone who could handle the Salesforce project since Mark's team was suddenly unavailable, and I sat up in bed, read it 3 times, opened my contacts, and called the Salesforce client I'd landed months earlier, a woman named Elena. She was the director of operations, and she picked up on the 3rd ring. So I said, "Maria, it's Jake, from Brennan Consulting. I wanted to reach out because," when she cut me off with a relieved, "Oh, thank God. Tyler's been dodging my calls for 2 weeks. Where have you been?" I told her I'd left the firm and was working on my own now. There was a pause on the line. Then she asked if I could still handle their project, and when I said yes, she told me to send a new contract because she'd sign it today, and just like that the call ended. I opened my laptop and started drafting agreements, and by noon I had 2 contracts signed. One with Microsoft for $180,000 over 6 months, and another with Salesforce for $95,000 over 4 months. $275,000 total, with first payments due within 15 days, meaning $68,750 was coming fast. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen, thinking about how I'd spent 2 weeks eating ramen and watching my savings disappear, and now suddenly I had more work than I could realistically handle by myself. The problem was I really was by myself, no office, no team, no website, just a laptop and a Gmail address. And when I checked my calendar and saw both projects kicked off in 3 weeks, it hit me that I had exactly 21 days to build a company from nothing. I spent the next week rotating through coffee shops, a different one every day, Starbucks on Monday, a local place Tuesday, Panera Wednesday, buying one coffee and sitting there for 6 hours feeling guilty enough to buy another, all while drafting proposals, building a basic Squarespace website for $216 a year, designing a logo on Canva using the free version, and filing paperwork to register Apex Strategies LLC for $850. I opened a business bank account with $8,200 in it, ate more ramen, discovered the dollar store sold off-brand granola bars, and bought 12 boxes, slowly starting to look like a guy who lived out of coffee shops, wearing the same hoodie 3 days in a row and forgetting to shave. The barista at Starbucks started recognizing me and had my order ready before I asked, and one morning she slid the coffee over and said rough week. And when I said something like that, she smiled and told me I'd get through whatever it was, which I didn't fully understand but somehow helped. I kept working, and 3 months later I landed another client, an Adobe partnership worth $65,000, bringing my total contracts to $340,000, the exact same number Tyler shredded, except this time, they belonged to me. I moved out of coffee shops into a tiny office, 1 room in a shared building with a tax accountant and a life coach. $100 a month, squeaky door, no windows, smelled like old carpet and someone's microwaved fish, but it had a desk, a lock on the door, and a sign outside that read Apex Strategies. On my first day there, I sat alone on a folding chair from Target, drinking a coffee the Starbucks barista had handed me earlier with a smile and a reminder that I had this. And instead of feeling proud, I mostly just felt exhausted. I tried hiring help and posted for a junior assistant on LinkedIn, got 43 applications, and hired a 24-year-old recent grad named Emily who was eager and organized but quit after 1 week with a Sunday night email saying things were too chaotic and that I didn't even have a printer, which I couldn't really argue with. I went back to doing everything myself: proposals, invoices, client calls, strategy decks, email campaigns, social posts, working 14-hour days that sometimes stretched to 16, and forgetting what weekends even felt like as my bank balance slowly climbed from $8,200 to $14,500 to $23,800. I stopped eating ramen every night and started buying real groceries like eggs, bread, and peanut butter that wasn't store brand, which somehow made me feel rich. About 6 months in, someone mentioned a Phoenix Marketing Association mixer on a Thursday night in a downtown hotel ballroom. And even though I hated networking events, I went because I needed clients and connections and couldn't keep doing everything alone. I showed up at 6:30 wearing the only blazer I owned, the same one from my last meeting at Brennan, which smelled faintly like mothballs and regret, grabbed a drink, and stood in a corner watching people shake hands and smile too hard until I overheard 2 guys at the bar talking about Brennan Consulting going downhill. One said Dad was trying to sell and couldn't find buyers. The other asked what happened, and the first explained that the kid who actually did the work had left, stumbling over my name before landing on Jake, while agreeing Tyler was CEO and title only and couldn't close a deal to save his life. They talked about lost clients, staff leaving, the asking price dropping from $625,000 to $425,000 with no interest, and how it was a shame because they liked working with me even if Tyler was just a mouthpiece. I stood there holding my drink and listening until they moved on, then pulled out my phone, searched Brennan Consulting for sale, and found the listing with the words owner retiring, which told me Dad had given up. I took a screenshot but didn't feel satisfied or victorious, just strangely hollow. Stayed another hour, made small talk, handed out 3 business cards, and turned 2 follow-up emails into one $40,000 contract the next week. Apex kept growing, and by 8 months in I signed a $180,000 deal with a tech startup, registered everything officially, hired a part-time bookkeeper, closed the year with $640,000 in revenue, brought on 2 remote employees, one for social media and one for research and admin, and moved into a bigger 2-room office with windows and no fish smell for $1,890 a month. I bought real furniture, an IKEA desk, a chair that didn't squeak, framed my first signed contract, and hung it on the wall. And 18 months after leaving Brennan, I had 4 full-time employees and $640,000 in annual revenue, while Dad's firm still hadn't sold. I checked the listing every few weeks and watched the price drop to $380,000, then $340,000, and stay stuck there, the same number Tyler shredded, which felt poetic in a way, and I saved screenshots without really knowing why. The family group chat stayed quiet and no one reached out, and I didn't either. And at a larger industry conference months later, I ran into a guy named Steve who used to work operations at Brennan, and when he recognized me and asked how things were going, I told him I was busy, and when he asked if Tyler was still reaching out, I said no. I blocked him, which made Steve laugh nervously and say that was probably smart. Steve shook his head and told me the place completely unraveled after I left, and that he'd bailed 4 months earlier, then asked where I ended up, and when I said I was freelancing for now and money was tight, I added that it still beats standing around watching a sinking ship, and we talked for about 10 minutes while he mentioned 3 other people who'd quit, how Dad couldn't keep staff anymore, and how Tyler was now running client meetings by himself and bombing most of them. Hearing it felt strange, like watching a building I used to live in slowly collapse from a distance, and it didn't make me feel good or vindicated, just finished, like that chapter was already closed. Steve asked if I was hiring. I told him I'd keep him in mind. He handed me his card, thanked me, and walked away, leaving me standing in the middle of the convention hall realizing that 2 years earlier I'd been the invisible guy at Brennan, and now people were quietly asking me for jobs, which didn't feel triumphant so much as unreal. I checked my phone and saw an email from a potential client, a Fortune 500 company asking for a meeting, so I replied immediately and booked it for the following Tuesday, then went home to the same tiny apartment I still hadn't upgraded, ate leftover Thai food, opened my laptop, and checked the Brennan Consulting listing one last time, still priced at $340,000 with no updates in 6 weeks. So I took another screenshot, filed it with the others, closed the laptop, and sat there in the quiet, realizing that for the first time in 18 months I wasn't scrambling, panicking, or questioning my decision. I was just building, slowly and quietly, without Tyler, without Dad, and without anyone who ever doubted me. And somehow that felt better than any revenge fantasy I'd ever had. Nearly 3 years passed after the Bentley, and Apex Strategies had grown to 22 employees with a downtown Phoenix office spanning 10,000 square feet, glass walls, real conference rooms, and actual furniture, and last year we brought in $2.7 million in revenue, enough that the Phoenix Business Journal called and asked to feature me in their 30 Under 30 issue. A photographer came by the office, positioned me by the window with the city skyline behind me, arms crossed, and I tried not to look uncomfortable. And when the article ran the next Tuesday with the headline From Storage Closet to Corner Office, Jake Brennan's Quiet Rise, it mentioned I'd left a family consulting firm to start my own company without naming Brennan Consulting, which honestly wasn't necessary. That day I got 43 emails from clients, potential hires, and even competitors congratulating me, along with one voicemail from a number I didn't recognize but knew was Mom's area code, which I deleted without listening. That Thursday afternoon, I was in a strategy meeting with Emma walking us through client timelines when my phone buzzed on the table. I ignored it. It buzzed again, and when I flipped it over, I saw a text from Emma saying someone was here to see me and claimed to be my brother with no appointment. I looked up and saw her across the table pretending not to watch my reaction, texted back asking if he'd said what it was about, and when she replied no and asked if she should reschedule him, I thought for a moment and asked how long she could make him wait, and when she said as long as I wanted, I told her to let him sit and that I'd see him after the 4 p.m. call. Tyler sat in the lobby for 90 minutes, And while I didn't watch him, Emma later told me she saw him test different chairs, sit, stand, sit again, stare at employees walking past who were young and confident and moving with purpose, study the glass walls, the modern art, and the company logo etched into the reception desk, everything he once assumed would be his, checking his phone every couple of minutes, and even filling a cup of water he never drank, looking like someone waiting for an interview he already knew he wouldn't get. My 4 p.m. call ran until 5:20, and when I walked into the lobby at 5:30, he was still there, staring at his phone, heavier than I remembered, wearing a cheap suit with frayed cuffs, a wrinkled shirt, and Kia keys sitting on the table beside him. And when he stood up and tried to smile at me, I didn't return it. I told him we could talk in the conference room. And as he followed me past my office, I saw his eyes flick to the nameplate that read Jake Brennan, founder and CEO, though he didn't comment on it. And once inside the glass-walled room overlooking the city, I closed the door, didn't offer him water, didn't sit, and told him he had 15 minutes. He blinked and started awkwardly, saying he knew we hadn't ended on good terms. And I cut in by reminding him he shredded $340,000 in contracts, and that Dad told me it was just paper, which made him flinch and go quiet before clearing his throat and telling me Dad's firm was closing, that they were $380,000 in debt with creditors circling, and Dad had taken a second mortgage on the house. I told him I knew because I'd seen the listing months earlier, and when he asked why I never called, I asked him why I would, which left him staring at me like the question didn't compute. After a long silence, he rubbed his face, looking older than 37, and said he needed help, asking for a $400,000 loan and promising to sign anything and pay it back with interest, and I said no, flat and final, which he seemed unable to process. When he pleaded that it wasn't for him but for Dad and his legacy, I told him to let it close, and when he said I couldn't be serious, I told him I was, because Dad chose him as that legacy, not me. Tyler looked away, jaw tight and breathing hard, and I watched anger drain out of his face and turn into something else before he finally broke, burying his face in his hands as his shoulders shook without sound, crumbling right there at the table. I stood there watching and felt something I didn't expect, not satisfaction or pity, just exhaustion. And when he finally looked up with red eyes and a cracked voice, admitting he'd messed up the contracts, the car, all of it, I told him I knew. And when he said it was really about Dad, and always had been because he was the oldest and Dad thought he was ready, he wiped his face with his sleeve and admitted he couldn't close deals and never could, that Dad handed him everything and he mistook that for earning it. He laughed then, a sharp, bitter sound that came out broken, and said that without me he was nothing and the firm was nothing too, before telling me where he worked now. Enterprise Rent-A-Car, making $19 an hour checking people into Nissan Sentras, and pretending he wasn't a $40,000 failure, and I just stared at him as he kept going, saying Jess had left and taken the kids to her mom's place in Tucson because she said he'd changed, that he'd coasted on Dad's name his whole life and didn't know who he was without it. And when he looked up at me and said she was right, the silence that followed felt heavy. He wiped his eyes again and said he knew he didn't deserve help, knew that completely, but maybe I was a better man than him, and maybe I'd help anyway. And I stood there with my arms crossed watching my brother fall apart in my own conference room, waiting to feel something like victory or vindication, but all I felt was tired. That old instinct kicked in, the one that spent 6 years fixing his messes and covering his gaps to make him look good, pulling at me to help and fix and save him. And then I remembered the shredder, the humming, and the way he walked past me like I didn't exist. I finally sat down and told him straight that I wasn't giving him $400,000, and he nodded like he'd expected that. So I added that I would give him something else, which made him look up as I told him I'd hire him as a junior account coordinator for $52,000 a year, working under Emma, who was 24 and would be his manager. He stared at me and said that was insulting, and I agreed that it was. And when he asked why I'd even offer it, I told him it was because he was right about one thing. I was a better man than him. But that didn't make me stupid, and if he wanted back in, he'd start at the bottom, prove he could actually work, and do it without shortcuts, nepotism, or a corner office. When he asked about Dad's firm, I told him to let it collapse, that it was built on Dad's pride and his incompetence, and there was nothing worth saving there. That Dad chose to risk the house when he mortgaged it instead of asking for help, and consequences existed even for him. Tyler sat there processing it all, a full minute or more passing while he looked like he wanted to argue or explain why it wasn't fair, but instead he just asked if he could think about it. And I told him no, that he could answer now or the offer expired. And when he said that wasn't fair, I reminded him neither was shredding 6 months of my work. He looked down, rubbed his eyes, and finally said he'd take it, and I told him to start Monday at 8:30 a.m. and that Emma would train him. Then stood up and walked to the door as he stood too and offered his hand, which I ignored while telling him he was an employee now, not my brother, and employees didn't shake hands on their first day. They showed up and worked. His hand dropped. I opened the door and walked him out to the lobby where Emma sat at the desk, told her Tyler would start Monday as a junior coordinator and that she'd be training him, and she nodded professionally while Tyler looked between us, opened his mouth, closed it, and said he'd see us Monday before leaving. I watched him walk to the elevator with his shoulders slumped and Kia keys in hand until the doors closed. And when Emma quietly said that was my brother, I said it was, then corrected myself and said it was, and went back to my office. I grabbed my jacket, keys, and laptop bag, saw it was 7:18 p.m., headed to the garage, and got into my car, no longer the old Civic, but a Camry I'd bought last year, nothing fancy, just dependable, and started driving home when my phone rang from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but I did, and heard Dad's voice for the first time in 3 years, sounding older and strained like he'd been yelling or crying. And I kept driving as he said Tyler told him what I'd offered and asked if I was really going to let everything he built disappear. I told him he built a firm that needed me to survive and then treated me like I was optional. So yes. And when he said he gave me opportunities and Tyler was his son, I told him so was I. And after a long silence filled only by road noise and my turn signal clicking, he said he'd made mistakes, that he saw that now, and apologized for not seeing what I was doing, for believing Tyler when he said the contracts were drafts, and for making me feel invisible. That was the apology I'd waited 6 years to hear, and I waited for it to feel good or bring closure, but it didn't. It just felt empty. So I told him I appreciated it, but it didn't change anything. And when he asked what he could do, begged even, I told him there was nothing to do, that we'd both made choices and were living with them. And when he asked if I was really going to watch him lose the firm and the house and 30 years of work, I reminded him he watched me give everything for 6 years and called it helpful while Tyler took the credit. I told him we were even and hung up, pulled into a gas station, sat there with the engine running and my hands on the wheel, blocked his number, waited a minute, then drove home. The apartment was still small and unchanged, 1 bedroom and quiet, and I set my bag down, took off my jacket, saw there were no new calls or texts, opened my laptop, replied to 3 new client inquiries, closed it, made pasta with jar sauce, ate alone, and thought about Tyler sitting in my lobby for 90 minutes and Dad's voice on the phone, realizing I felt no anger or satisfaction, just the calm certainty that I'd built something they couldn't touch and didn't need their approval or apology anymore. I washed the dish, went to bed, and knew that Monday Tyler would start under Emma, Dad's firm would close, the house might go, and I'd keep building, not out of revenge or to prove anything, but because I finally stopped waiting for permission to succeed. 6 months later, Dad's firm officially shut down, sold the client list for almost nothing, filed bankruptcy on the debts, and sold the house under market value to cover most of what they owed, and Mom and Dad moved into a small 1-bedroom apartment in Tempe that cost $200 a month, quiet and stripped down, fitting somehow. I heard about it later through a mutual contact and never reached out. And from what I saw, Tyler showed up to work every single day at 8:30 sharp, never late and never complaining, doing exactly what Emma told him to do, learning the systems, and finally dropping the habit of looking for shortcuts. The first 90 days were rough. Emma told me he struggled, made mistakes, asked too many questions, and clearly wasn't used to earning his place. But he stuck with it and slowly got better, and by month 4 he started closing small accounts. By month 6 he handled a client meeting on his own and did fine, kept his head down, worked, and went home. We barely spoke, just passed each other in the hallway, nodded, and kept moving, professional and distant, and that's all it was anymore. Apex climbed to $3.4 million in revenue with 31 employees and a bigger downtown office, and I still lived in the same 1-bedroom apartment, still paid $340 a month, never upgraded, Ate dinner alone most nights. Pasta, sandwiches, leftovers from lunch. I dated a woman named Sarah for 3 months, a marketing director at a tech startup, but she left in October and said I was married to my work and didn't let anyone in, which wasn't wrong. In December, Mom mailed me a handwritten card with no return address that said she didn't understand what happened but missed her son, and I kept it in a drawer and didn't reply. One Saturday afternoon, I went to Costco for office supplies and saw Tyler at a register with a cart full of bulk diapers, off-brand ramen, generic cereal, and a gallon of milk, and when we locked eyes, he looked away, first while I didn't. I checked out a couple lanes over and caught up to him in the parking lot where he was loading groceries into an old Honda Civic that looked worse than my old one, and I finally said hey, which surprised him. We stood there in silence until I asked how Emma was as a manager, and he said she was tough but fair, and I told him that was good, and after another awkward pause he thanked me for the job. I told him he was earning it, and that the first 90 days he was terrible, but he got better, and he almost smiled and said that was high praise coming from me. He told me Jess was talking to him again and letting him see the kids on weekends, and that he was rebuilding, and I told him that was good. Then he looked at me and said I won, and I asked if I really had, because I had a business and he had his kids, and he didn't answer right away. He asked if I ever thought about Mom and Dad, and I said every day, but I couldn't go back to being invisible even if it meant being alone, and he nodded like he understood. We drove off without waving. A year later, Apex closed a $1.8 million contract, the biggest deal we'd ever done, and Tyler was in the room as a senior strategist, quiet, professional, having worked on the proposal, and when the client asked how long he'd been with Apex, Tyler said 2.5 years, and that he'd started at the bottom and worked up, and I didn't say a word. That fall I bought a condo, modern and empty, bigger than I needed, and while unpacking I found an old photo of me and Tyler as kids building Legos, smiling, and I stared at it for a long time before putting it in a drawer, not throwing it away, just putting it out of sight. Late one night months later my phone rang, and it was Dad, telling me he saw the article and was proud of me, and I waited for that to feel good, and it didn't. And when he asked if we could maybe get coffee sometime, I said okay without promising anything. I drove home past his old office building, now someone else's, and thought about sitting in that storage closet at 22 believing hard work would be enough, and it was, just not the way I imagined. Now my agency is worth over $4 million. Tyler works for me and does his job well. Dad rents an apartment. Mom sends cards I don't answer, and some nights I sit in my quiet condo and realize the real cost wasn't the Bentley or the firm or the years of silence. It was the family I had to lose to stop being invisible, and even knowing that, I'd still choose it again, just not call it winning anymore.